Okay, so let's talk about the historian's interpretation of the West. So, in this first interpretation, we have Frederick Jackson Turner, which is a name you definitely should recognize. He wrote the Frontier Thesis in 1893, basically talking about how the American frontier was now closed for settlement after the 1890 census. Basically, saying that there's no more places left for people to settle in the West. It's been fully settled. And so, this is what he says about the West. He talked about the frontier as like a line dividing savagery and civilization up here, right? And he talks about how that line, as people moved west, they crossed into this place of the frontier, this wilderness, and they had to adjust, right? And it's the way that they become kind of American, right? The West is the frontier, and that's where you become American. You become an individualist, right? Because you have to survive kind of on your own. There's no, there's no cities, no people to rely on. You can only rely on yourself. And because of that, he talks about the frontier states that came into the Union in the beginning. They came in with the most democratic voting laws. This goes back to this idea of universal male suffrage, no property requirements, that kind of thing, like that era of the common man. So he says the West is fundamentally a more democratic place because of this individualism. Okay, and that as a result, this frontier is gone. This has been the development of the American kind of identity as this kind of place where the West brings democracy and individual ideas and individualism to the rest of the country. Our next historian, this is Richard White, and he's writing in a book called Born Modern, an overview of the West. And he talks about the federal government, the power of the federal government. This is going to be a theme in this class from this point forward, where we're going to see the power of the federal government is going to be growing. And he says the place where the federal government exerted its most power is the West. Outside of Reconstruction during after the Civil War, where the military controlled the South. But he says after that, it was the West where the federal government had the most kind of power. The army was in the West. Think about the Indian Wars, right? The government controlled most of the West lands. Think about the Homestead Act, right? You have government bureaucracies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Forest Service. These are all things that the federal government did to control the land of the West. And so the power of the federal government was greatest in the West, is what White kind of argues here. Finally, we have Patricia Nelson Limerick, and she's talking about the West as a meeting ground. This is almost in direct opposition to Turner, right? Turner is saying that the frontier, divided savagery and civilization. And she says it's not that simple, right? There's no line. It was a common ground. You had groups that were meeting together, sometimes happily, sometimes not, right? Native Americans, Mexican, white settlers, African Americans, Chinese immigrants, they all were part of the West. So she's saying the West was this meeting ground of a variety of groups. It's not as simple as savagery and civilization as Turner says. She says it's much more complex than that. That the West is a place where all these groups kind of met together, and there was conflict, and there was cooperation, and all those kinds of things were part of the West.